welcome to Local Stories. Welcome back, many of you. You can see some familiar faces, and welcome if you've joined us for the first time. This was a programme we started in lockdown, but we're now carrying on a monthly basis. And the idea really is it's a short programme and we look at the history of local people and places. And our theme for this month is Metroland. So one of our volunteers, Ralph, has kindly offered to do a talk. So I'll introduce him in a minute. And then our 5-minute focus is going to be on the 2 London Transport posters that we have in our collection. And then our quiz, our bit of fun at the end, is around the meaning behind house names and street names locally. So we'll start with Ralph. Ralph's a brilliant volunteer for the museum. And if you've ever looked at the museum website, a lot of the way it looks, its maintenance is down to him. He does a tremendous amount of work on it. But he himself has a long history, a long interest in the history of the railway and the development of railways, particularly around London. And so he had written an article and done some research about a year or so ago about Metroland, and he kindly offered to do a short version of his talk for us today. So Ralph, are you okay if I hand over to you?
Right. You all see it okay?
Yes.
Right, we're in business then. Okay, thanks for the introduction, Emily. First of all, let's just look at what drove the need for commuting. London started the 19th century at a population of around 1 million, and within 100 years that had grown to about 6 million. This was common throughout the 19th century as Britain moved from an agricultural economy, so the same period saw the growth of many of our Victorian cities. But of course this growth left its legacy in terms of overcrowding and insanity. Just imagine increasing the population of a city like London by 5 million in relatively short space of time. The overcrowding was most evident in the east of the capital, and this, what we see here is one of the famous Booth maps. Booth recorded basically every street in what was then a relatively small London and rated it by the degree of poverty and the degree of wealth, with the darkest areas, the black streets, really being sort of semi-criminal. So you can see within this area around Stepney, and there is an awful lot of dark areas on that map, which was pretty common at that time. London clearly needed to grow outwards to accommodate this growth. Here you can see this is a map from relatively recent, only 1900, and the city, the built-up area, as you can see, is quite small. Many of what we now consider inner suburbs were still rural at around 1900. But there were quite big constraints to outward growth of London. Until the mid-19th century, most working class and middle classes walked to work. There really wasn't a great deal of alternatives. Buses, horse-drawn buses, were the only public transport. And as most roads were unsurfaced outside the central area, they were often impassable in bad weather. So really the only people that commuted up until the second half of the 19th century were the well-off, the better off. And in fact, many of those did build some pretty grand houses quite close to the stations further out in what we now consider the suburbs. But another important point was that really the railways had very little interest in commuter traffic. Most of their income in those days came from freight, bringing coal and other goods into the city from Midlands and the north. Stopping commuter trains just got in the way of both those freight trains and of the faster, longer distance trains. So really, they just weren't interested in commuter trains. And railways added to the problem of the congestion. The Corporation of London forbid the railway companies to come into the centre. So unlike New York, for example, with its Grand Central Station with lines going off in every direction, London finished up with a number of stations all around the periphery of what was then really the built-up area. So the result of this was that there was an awful lot of congestion as people travelled from station into the centre, but also station to station. And the very building of the railways, not just the stations and the lines, but the massive railway lands to accommodate these huge freight yards which existed around nearly all of these terminus stations, resulted in the loss of thousands of homes during the construction. So the problem really needed a pretty drastic solution. In fact, there were two key issues. Something had to be done about the severe congestion in the centre. And secondly, something had to be done to allow London to grow outwards. The first point, covering central London congestion, well, quite a number of people had put forward some ideas, some of them quite ambitious, including Pax that designed the Crystal Palace, but many of these were just too ambitious. The only one that really had a realistic chance of being done was the one put forward by Charles Pearson, a solicitor at the Corporation of London. And he proposed building an underground railway line from Paddington through to Farringdon, linking the various mainline railways along the way. It was to be built using a cut and cover technique. In effect, this meant building a massive trench and then tunneling over it, or building a lid over it and then restoring the road, causing huge disruption. And there were quite a few events that happened during its construction. In fact, from when it was first proposed back in 1846, it was another 17 years before the line opened. There'd been opposition from politicians, there'd been opposition from local residents. The physical difficulties of doing something that had never been done before was quite challenging. And not least, they had to raise an awful lot of capital. It was very, very expensive. But it did open in 1863, and it was an immediate success. People flocked to use it, despite the fact that it was steam trains running in tunnels, and the atmosphere in those tunnels was quite bad. Just for completion, the Metropolitan District Railway, which we now know just as the District, opened 5 years later, which really completed the circle. And incidentally, this was built in conjunction with the embankment and the building of the London sewer system by Joseph Bazalgette, another very pioneering activity. The next phase, of course, was to allow London to expand outwards. And politicians really from the middle of the 19th century were aware that something needed to be done to encourage London to grow outwards. The 1844 Railway Act was really the first time governments had really interfered in the running of the railways. And they laid down certain stipulations that every day at least one train should stop at all stations. They laid down provisions in terms of being seated and covered. They capped the fares, and they also declared a minimum average speed. But these so-called parliamentary trains, which were aimed at solving the problem, weren't liked by the railway companies for the reasons I pointed out earlier, and were often not very conveniently timed. So the Railway Act didn't really achieve what Gladstone had set out for it to. But slowly, railway companies did see the potential for commuting, particularly the railways that served stations such as Liverpool Street, Broad Street, Fenchurch Street, and many of the southern ones. This was helped by the fact that by this time, many of the railway companies had quadrupled their tracks and had more capacity on their system to bring in commuter trains. As a result, development was rapid in these new, what we now know as in the suburbs, the one at the bottom, Hackney, for example, on the Eastern line, or in that case, the Broad Street line, and that incidentally is the road where my grandma lived. So development was underway. London moved outwards rather than upwards. And it's interesting to know that even today, the population density of Paris is nearly 4 times that of London. Londoners are far more likely to commute further and live in a house with a garden than their Paris counterparts. So the legacy really of the railways ability to move people in from the suburbs was very important to the way London has developed. Coming back then to the Metropolitan and the expansion of the Metropolitan, we have to start really with a gentleman that's perhaps not as well known as some of the other railway figures, but he was still a giant figure. Sir Edward Watkins. He was the director or chair of railways in the UK, in North America and in France. And he became the chairman of the Metropolitan in 1872 and was very much the driving force of taking it from a local, you could say, underground line just going within London to broadening out more akin to a mainline railway. The Metropolitan under his watch expanded eastwards to Moorgate, westwards to Hammersmith. Importantly for us, obviously, the northwest, reaching Harrow in 1880, Chesham in 1889, and then Amersham and Aylesbury in 1892. After Watkins moved on, there were a few other additions. Later branches were built to Uxbridge, to Stanmore, now forming part of the Jubilee line, and the last one, the Watford branch. And there was very much, very influential support for what Watkins did. Harold Verney, an important local landowner, said, when the railway from Harrow to Wendover is made, the whole district will be studded with residents, which will make the fortune of the line. It is on the healthy side of London, and surely it would be worthwhile for capitalists to embark money on such schemes. Similarly, the influential Illustrated London News compares living in the Chiltern Hills with living in the Swiss Alps or the Jura Mountains, pointing out that artists and etc. will flood to the area. Just having a look at some of the other Watkins projects which are of interest. His real base and his strength lied in Manchester, where he managed the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway. An extension of this was built through to London Marylebone, opening in 1899. It's interesting to see that this was the last of the main lines built to London, and by this time many of the constraints that had faced the earlier railway builders had been overcome. So the line was built for heavier trains, for higher speeds, even to suit larger freight sizes and even double-deck trains. And in fact, if it hadn't rather foolishly been shut by Dr. Beach in the mid-1960s, the arguments in favour of HS2 would have been much, much weaker, because we would have already had a fairly high-speed line serving cities such as Manchester. Watkins' most ambitious plan, though, was his Channel Tunnel. His idea was to link his hometown of Manchester to Paris, using tracks all under his control: the Great Central, the Metropolitan, the South Eastern Railways, and France's Chemin de Fer du Nord. Construction began in 1880, and it reached over a mile under the channel before the politics and military concerns stopped it. When the existing Channel Tunnel was under construction, they came across part of his tunnel, and in fact the engineers were quite confident that if it had been allowed to continue, he would have reached France without any problem. Probably his most infamous legacy was Watkins Tower, or Watkins Folly. His plan was to generate traffic for the railway by building a rival to the Eiffel Tower at Wembley. Slightly taller, incidentally, than the Eiffel Tower. It got as far as the first level, and as you can see in the picture, but it never achieved any further than that because money ran out, and it also suffered from structural defects. It's fair to say that Watkins was much more of a visionary than he was a financial expert. Many of his projects failed to perform and deliver suitable returns for their shareholders. The Manchester, Sheffield and Lincoln Railway, which was really where he started with railways, otherwise known as the MS&L, was also called Money Sunk and Lost. And the Great Central, which it evolved into, was then referred to as gone completely. The reality is that the earlier main lines had taken the prime routes, and really much of what the Metropolitan line, in our case, picked up didn't have any significant towns generating traffic. Chesham, for example, was the most important town it served, and there was still only less than 10,000 residents. And what's more, the Metropolitan needed quite significant investment by this time, with new rolling stock required, and most importantly, electrification, so they could get rid of the steam trains operating through the underground lines. Watkins did have to resign due to ill health, and the two people that took over are really credited with turning the Metropolitan round and establishing it as with what we're familiar with. Charles McLaren Bart took over as chairman in 1904, and the inspirational Robert Selby joined as general manager in 1908. And they had a fairly simple, you could say, but also revolutionary plan. If the traffic wasn't there, they were going to create it, and they certainly did. They were, with the Metropolitan Railways, really early adopters of using marketing, and the goal was quite simple: to generate traffic. In 1915, there was a booklet with a rather dull name called the Guide to the Extension Line. They took this booklet and renamed it the Metroland Guide, and some would say the rest is history. These annual guides promoted the countryside the line served as a place both to visit for recreation, but most importantly, as a place to live. In fact, across the whole network, the slogan was "Live in Metroland." This was even engraved on the door plates within the carriages, but numerous booklets and other literature was produced to support living in Metroland and visiting Metroland. Here's just some examples from the museum collection: walks around Amersham, details about the town, and fortunately we're still able to see many of these views today. Compared to the other railway companies as well, they had an advantage. When railways were built, it was often necessary for them to buy up land from the existing landowners, which wasn't needed. You know, they had to buy perhaps a whole field when they only needed part of it. Whereas the other railway companies had to give this land back or sell it back at cost price to the original landowners, the Metropolitan Railway, for some reason, by Act of Parliament, had been allowed to retain it. And they set up a nominally independent company called the Metropolitan Railway Country Estates, which enabled them to sell off this surplus land and develop it for profit. Now, if you think about it today, land bought, let's say, as farmland is worth far, far less than land suitable for property development. And they took full advantage of this. Encouragingly, this is the sort of wording that they used in their literature. If you are seeking a home, large or small, old world or modern, you will find it in Metroland, the glorious countryside, easily and quickly reached by the Metropolitan Railway. The train service is frequent, the season ticket rates are low, the education facilities are excellent, and the local golf courses both numerous and good. This was 100 years ago, still equally true today. And then in the booklets, they provided much more details about golf courses, about education, the local rates, and importantly, season tickets, costs and times. And this use of marketing was hugely successful. From World War I right through into the 1920s, Metroland absolutely boomed. London had a fast growing middle class, and they took full advantage of affordable mortgages falling for the company's advertising. The target market was unashamedly middle class, whereas perhaps in the East, services from the Great Eastern, etc., had huge working class clientele. The Metropolitan Railway went unashamedly for people with more money. The architecture was typically conservative rather than revolutionary, often referred to as Tudor-Beaton. Lovely brochures were produced for the time, promoting the various houses that was available. And it wasn't just the houses, there was luxury for the traveller. This is a picture of a first-class carriage from the era. There was also a Pullman service introduced from 1910, so you could sit in luxury and have your breakfast on the way to Liverpool Street in the morning and your dinner on your way home. Coming then to look more specifically at Amersham and its role in Metroland, Amersham on the Hill owes its existence to the coming of the railway in 1892. As you can see on this map here, there was virtually nothing around the station when it first opened, such that the railway company actually built Station Road to make it easier for people to get from the old town where people then lived up to the station. But obviously development was pretty rapid. The Weller Metroland estate was in fact the last and the furthest of the true Metroland estates from London. The land had been bought from the estate of the former brewer, George Weller, for 18,000. And when it was launched in 1930, it was planned to have 535 houses and 51 shops, ranging in price from £875 through to £1,200. Sounds cheap by today's standards, but actually in that era, it was quite high compared to the cost of housing in many other parts of London. Not all of the development was finally built, but the areas to look for are Woodside Close, the Drive and the Rise. Here is a map, which is on our website, showing the full extent of the original plan. This is the railway down here, Hill Avenue, Station Road, and as you can see, quite significant development with various green spaces in tune with the Metro land architecture. It really all came to an end in the mid-1930s when the Metropolitan Railway was forced out of existence, when the government insisted that it became part of the new London Passenger Transport Board. The management strongly opposed this, but they really weren't given any alternative. And this put them under the same management as all the other underground railways, as well as the London tram and bus services. But it's fair to say that the new organisation learnt a lot from the way the Metropolitan had used advertising and continued to produce various booklets promoting living in the suburbs, as well as walks and recreation. And by this time, because the Metropolitan had created a lot of people living out along the route of the Metropolitan Railway, they were now in a position to start promoting and producing adverts, encouraging people to go into London, for example, to go to the theatre, visit museums, etc., many of which we still see today. To summarise then, the Metropolitan Railway didn't invent commuting, it was already underway, but for certain they did invent Metro land. Today, of course, the term Metro land is widely used to describe leafy city suburbs, and not just in London, in other parts of the world, the term is widely used.
Thank you, Ralph. That was brilliant. I thought it was brilliant when we went through it yesterday as well. It's really, really good. You covered so much content there, and hopefully for those that didn't really know where the term comes from or the logic behind it, you've really unpacked that. And I found it really interesting, the bits that you started with around London and London development and how we've gone out, not up. Ralph's really happy to take any questions, so if you've got them, you can either just unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can put something into the chat. So feel free to go ahead.
Yes, please.
Go ahead, Ernest.
Emma. Thank you.
It's Patrick.
Oh, I think there's two people. So Ernest, if you go first, and then I think Patrick, if you go next.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a funny story which I can't remember. Perhaps you can remind me of it. All the North London termini are on the Circle line, except for Euston. There was some peculiar reason why Euston didn't connect with the Circle line. Can you remind me of that, please?
I think there's a few different theories, but when the Metropolitan was built, it relied very heavily on support from the Great Western, which were very anxious to be able to reach the city. And in fact, you know, much as Crossrail is going to do today, the Great Western ran trains right the way through using the tunnels. In fact, because they had 7-foot gauge, the Metropolitan was actually built with 7-foot as well as 4-foot tracks, 4'8" tracks. But their big rival was the London North Western. So one of the stories is that there was never actually any rails connecting the lines from Euston, whereas there was from King's Cross, there was from St Pancras, and there was at Liverpool Street, but there were none from Euston. And one of the theories is that was because of opposition of the Great Western.
Pat, you had a question next.
Yes, would Ralph like to speak about Squire Drake and his opposition to any railway coming through Amersham, old Amersham?
Well, of course, yeah, that's wherever the railways were built, there was really the local landowners fell into two camps: the ones that were going to make money from it and the ones that were more bothered about it spoiling their view. And Squire Drake, of course, came really into the second category, whereas you could say Weller, the other influential person in Amersham, took full advantage, selling land to the railway and making money out of it, both for the railway itself, but also for the subsequent development of the Weller estate. So it's quite interesting, and whether or not Drake regretted it, we will never know.
He did, Drake land was sold for the railway and some of their land for housing development. So I think Longfield Park was Drake land, so some of the land beyond was Drake land, I think. So they, in the end, the family realised, but not without earlier opposition, and that, you know, that's why it's up on the hill. But we were talking the other day in the museum, there were other schemes, and that would have there was one through Old Amersham, but there was a scheme I think that went across Chesham Boys Common. And Ralph, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about the branch line to Chesham.
Yeah, the branch line to Chesham was actually not intended as a branch line. The railway company, the Metropilitan, actually bought land beyond Chesham because the plan was to join the London and North Western further north, I think in the Tring area. But once they'd built their own line through to Aylesbury, that never really happened, and I think they really lost interest in that extension, and bit by bit the land was sold off again.
I thought it happened in the other order. I thought he gave up before he got to Chesham, and people had to put their hands in their pockets to finish it off into the town. Well, and it was actually this bit that he kept on with. Yeah,
that is quite true. But they still actually bought land past Chesham with a long, let's say, with a plan to extend it. But you're quite right that they did leave it to the people of Chesham. But this wasn't unusual. These sort of tricks weren't unusual in the building of the railways in the 19th century. Quite often, the railway companies expected local people to chip in order to get a station perhaps in a better position.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
There is a question in the chat. Peter asked, how has home working impacted on the number of people using the trains?
I did see. I don't know
if you were able to answer that.
Yeah, well, the figures are dramatic. You know, there's no doubt about it. I believe I saw only this week one of the railway companies said that traffic is still only 40% what it was prior to the pandemic. So I think some services have survived more, but clearly, yes, there's been a huge hit onto railway usage. And one of the things which has been in the newspapers quite recently is this sort of talk of the need for more flexible season tickets, because the likelihood is that no one or very few people are going to go back to sort of the traditional 5-day commute, but perhaps 2 or 3 days in the office, 2 or 3 days working at home. And really the ticketing has got to suit this. And the danger, of course, is that if the ticketing doesn't, then more people will use their cars, which is not good for the environment or good for people's stress levels either. No,
thank you. Are there any more questions?
Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, go on, Anne. Yep, you go next.
Oh, excuse me. But going back to the land, is that why there's a bend at Rickmansworth? Because the owner wouldn't let him build the railway along?
I don't honestly know the answer, but it's possible. Yes.
That's what I grew up with, but I just wondered whether it was true.
There's various reasons why there are anomalies in the system, like bends and tunnels and other things.
Yes.
Be down to local landowners, but it can also be to physical constraints. The early trains in the 19th century weren't very good at going up hills. So tunnels were rather expensive and cuttings were rather expensive. So they tended to go round them rather than through them. And so take the line, for example, from Musdeum, which was the first line to the north. It's an extremely bendy line. And that's why to get speeds, they went for these tilting trains, the Pendolino trains, to try and improve speed. Whereas if you take the Great Central, the one that I mentioned, even the London North Eastern line from King's Cross, these are much straighter and are capable of running at higher speeds because of the bends. But there's certainly a number of reasons. I don't know the specific one at Rickman.
I think you are right, Anne. I don't know if someone else who knows more is able to elaborate, but I think you are right about it.
The other thing, actually, is I remember the Sheffield Cutler And my aunt, because we lived in Watford, actually used to always pick it up at Harrow. Yes. When did they stop that?
Well, the line, the Great Central finally shut in 1965.
Yeah, that was it. Yes.
But I think that the Master Cutler was continued as a named train and ran for many years into St Pancras along the Midland Main Line.
Oh, okay. Thank
But
you.
in the early days, the Master Cutler ran through Amersham.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Oh, did it?
Yes.
I think we have a photograph in the collection, actually.
We used to wave to it from a school called St Nicholas off White Line Road when I was a nipper. We waved to it going by at about 2:30 each day.
Oh. So did it go into Marylebone then?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you.
Ernest, I see you've got your hand up again. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, just talking about the Master Cutler and going up this line. When I was a schoolboy in the sort of 1950s, we used to go out to Aylesbury quite frequently. And not only, if we were lucky, did we take the Master Cutler from Harrow, next stop Aylesbury, which was just time to have coffee in the dining car before we got out, but also on the way back, on the ordinary Metropolitan line train back from Amersham, back from Aylesbury, all steamhold. If you were lucky, when you got to Wendover, we had to back into a siding to let the Master Cutler come through. And the siding into which we backed was the old little branch line that went to Halton Airfield. And there's still traces of it visible to this day. Mainly, take the Aylesbury Road out of Wendover. When you pass the appropriate point, there's a house that still has a little crossing gates embedded into its own gate.
Yes.
Voila.
Oh, that's a lovely story, Ernest. How very civilized. Sounds like a nice journey as well. Stuart, you've got your hand up.
Yes, Ralph's mention of Metropolitan Railway Country Estates has reminded me that development company obviously continued to exist after the Metropolitan was merged with all the other London transport lines. And you've reminded me that my first ever property purchase in the early 60s was a tiny cottage in Cheneys, and the vendors were the Metropolitan Railway Country Estates. Now, then it had the reputation of being owned by Lord and Lady Docker. I wonder who might remember them. They were famous or infamous.
The golden car.
Driving around London in a gold-plated Rolls Royce.
Yes.
And but they obviously, I'm assuming if that story is true, that they would have bought the rump of the business, and they would have managed and eventually sold off these properties.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Stuart. That's another good story.
Something I'd like to say.
Go on, yes, please.
I come from the London Borough of Harrow originally, and discovered that my nearest tube station at the time was Queensbury, which didn't actually exist when the Stanmore branch was built. The station was at Kingsbury, and then nothing until Cannons Park. And when they decided to put a station at Queensbury, they thought, well, since Kingsbury is just down the road, they'd call it Queensbury. But before that, it didn't exist. And they bought quite a lot of land, because they built the station that contains the ticket facilities and the shops, but as well as what now became the sort of large roundabout in front of the railway station.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's reflected locally too. So certainly Chalfont Road, which is now Chalfont and Latimer, there was very little there when that station opened, and now there's a whole, village or town. And Amersham, although there was Amersham at the bottom of the hill, our new town has developed around it too. So the end result really was what they wanted, wasn't it? That these towns developed for people to commute on, where originally there was nothing.
Yeah. Well, certainly during the 1930s, there was a massive railway-led expansion of London, a sort of second wave, if you like, of mass house building. Many of the sort of semi-detached suburbia sort of thing all the way around London really came through that era. And much of this came really as result of the Great Depression in the 1920s, the government set about a thing called the New Works Programme, where they provided central funding for building of railways, but also of roads like the Great West Road out of London, the Great Southend Road on the eastern side. But many of the main lines at that time, or you could say local main lines, were converted to underground lines. So parts of the of the Northern Line, the Central Line, etc., all came from that era.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm going to move on now to our next section, but we will have time for a few more questions at the end. If there's anything else you want to ask, Ralph. In previous sessions, I've mentioned before, I'll show you a few links for further information at the end, but I will just promote this book, which I absolutely love, called London's Metroland. As far as I know, it's out of print. It was written by someone called Alan Jackson, but you can still buy it from secondhand booksellers if you go online. Aid Books sometimes have copies. But what's really brilliant is it's basically a chronology of all of the annual booklets that were produced to promote Metroland, which Ralph showed you a few screenshots of. And they're very hard to get hold of, the original booklets. They come up on eBay occasionally, but they go for £200, something like that normally. So, but this book covers all of them in chronological order and all the lovely illustrations that they had. So this is one of the last ones, which features Amersham's Weller estate, which you can just about see on my screen with pictures of that, but it details it all. So it's a really great book. If you want to find out a little bit more about that kind of material that was produced around promoting Metroland, then I suggest that's the book to have a look at. So now for our 5-minute focus, we're going to look at 2 posters in the museum's collection. So hopefully everyone can see that. Ralph, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So we have 2 posters in our collection, which we absolutely love. They're on display. Many of you might have seen them if you've been to visit the museum. They were given to us in 2011 by the London Transport Museum, and it was part of a programme called Access to Art, where they were distributing copies where they had some duplicates of posters from their amazing poster collection. Obviously they looked at sort of connections with the places and the posters, and we were really lucky to be given 2 that link back to the Metropolitan line. So the first one is this one, Away by Metropolitan, and it was designed in 1936 by the artist Graham Sutherland. And it's a lovely poster. Note the prices, but also note that it says cheap day return tickets from Baker Street. So a lot of what Ralph was talking to you about was encouraging people to move out to around these new stations and buy a Metroland home and then commute in for work, but also commute in to go to the theatre or to go shopping and the sort of bright lights of the city. But just in reverse, there was also this huge push to get Londoners to do day trips out to the countryside, and in our case, the Chilterns, and that's exactly what this post is doing. And if you're able to read the small print at the bottom, it says Underground Guide for times of trains, price 2p, also Chiltern strolls and rambles, describing many pleasant walks, and says that you can get it at the local bookstore. So it was a really kind of concerted effort. You know, you'd see the poster, you'd want to go, and then you could buy the guide so that you could do your guided walk when you got there. And we do have a couple of the walks guides in our collection too. So I think it's a great poster. Graham Sutherland worked for London Transport between 1933 and 1936, so he was employed to work for them. He was born in 1903 in London, and originally he worked as an engineering apprentice for the Midland Railway, which I thought was interesting, but decided that he wasn't really interested in that and instead went on to Goldsmiths to study art, where he particularly looked at engraving and etching. And that's really where he developed his career in the 1920s. And in the 30s, he spent this time working for London Transport, and this is one of the posters that he designed. He'd also designed posters for other companies, including Shell, and he became a portrait painter later on. And perhaps one of his most well-known portraits was his least successful, because it was one of Churchill, which he absolutely hated. And his wife subsequently destroyed it. But still, I think it's a great poster. And one of his most famous pieces of work that you might know is the tapestry Christ in Glory in Coventry Cathedral. The second poster is this one, The Country Now, which was designed in 1938 by Claire Leighton. And Claire has actually some quite local connections, which I'll explain. So again, it's a great poster. It mentions the Chess Valley and the Chiltern country, and shows you people working in the woods. Now, Claire was also born in London in 1898, and she studied at the Brighton College of Art, Slade School, and the Central School of Arts and Crafts, which was particularly significant for her career because that's where she learnt a lot about wood engraving, and she worked under someone called Noel Rook. So that sort of became her medium, and then her subject, a lot of her work focuses on sort of scenes of rural life and working class people. And she developed that interest partly after art school by travelling through Europe, and it's very much reflected in her work, just as it is in this scene here. She did come to live locally in the Chilterns, and one of the books that she published which featured her work was called A Gardener's Chronicle, and that features many images of her garden in the Chilterns. But she also, her work's also in a book called The Farmer's Year, which you might have seen. She's part of a more famous family in a way, and if you read a bit more about her, she very much lived in the shadow of her brothers, and one of her brothers was Roland Leighton, who was killed in the First World War, and he is immortalised in Vera Britton's Testament of Youth. But if you read more about her family, certainly her mother very much valued her sons over and above Claire. Her local link is that she had a relationship with a man called Henry Knowles Brailsford, whose family lived in Amersham. He was a radical journalist, and his mother lived on London Road with Knowles' sister Mabel. And we know a fair amount about them as a family because we have a transcript of Mabel's diary from the Second World War, written in the 1940s, which was randomly found in a desk. And so that gives us a little bit more information about Amersham in the war and about the Leighton family, or about the Brailsford family. Claire met Noel in 1928, and unfortunately their relationship was sort of doomed really. He was already married and his wife wouldn't grant him a divorce. When she eventually died around the time of this poster was designed in 1937, Claire and Noel didn't end up together, and not long after this was designed, she moved to America and started a new life there. So as well as it being a really interesting poster, it's interesting to put it into context of her life at the time and her local connection. I'm going to stop sharing now. I don't know if anyone's got any questions about posters or material or publicity material produced as part of Metroland. There is a book that you also can buy called Metroland, which is a reprint of one of the booklets with a preface by Oliver Green, who has written a lot about railways. So that's another publication you can buy. Ernest?
Just a comment, arising out of those posters, and they're advertising the ticket prices out of Baker Street to here and there, which we saw earlier on. I was brought up in Wembley Park, and as a boy, we sometimes went out for walks, and you could buy a ticket outward to Great Missenden and return from Amersham, and spend the intervening time walking from one to the other, which was pretty convenient. Except it wasn't convenient for our dog, which we had at the time, which was a dachshund, because we did that walk, and it was a relatively wet day, and walking across the fields, because dachshunds are pretty low slung, it got terribly wet and got a disease that dachshunds are prone to, and died pretty well as a result of the cheap walker's ticket out from Wembley Park and back.
Oh dear, oh Ernest, oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
The interesting thing was that they had these walker's tickets where you could go to one place and get a return from somewhere else.
Well, it's interesting that you've mentioned that because one of the, we're developing some new walks at the moment, self-guided walks, and Stuart, who's on the call, he has been working on one which is a walk from Little Chalfont station to Amersham station. So the idea is you could get the train to Chalfont from London and then travel back again from Amersham. So I don't know whether we'll have to think about making sure it's safe for dogs, but I'm sure Stuart's considered that. Peter, you've got your hand up. Oh, you've got something to show.
Yeah, Emily, I've got a set of 3 London walks that were produced by London Transport for 3p a book, and I've got 1, 2 and 3, and the third one has got over the hills from Amersham to Rickmansworth via Coles Hill, Brentford Grange, the Forest, Silver Hill, Chalfont St Giles, Newlands, Bottom and the canal, 11 miles. That's a good long walk.
Yes.
Oh, I'd love to see that. I think we've got number 2 in our collection, but I don't think we've got number 3. And actually, interestingly, they're all wood engravings, aren't they, on the cover? I wonder if...
Yeah. And also another one, Country Walks, I've got. Well, that cost 2 and 6p. So my parents bought these. But yes, well, there we are.
They're super. Oh, they're lovely things to have. I'd be interested, yeah, if there are any Amersham walks, perhaps you could take some photos of them and send them to us. I'd love to see
Yes,
them.
I'll scan them.
Thank you, that would be great. Ian, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Emily. You may notice the backdrop I've got is a prospectus map from the Metropilitan and St John's Wood Railway. I operate a railway archive full of original railway documents. I wondered if the museum would like any of the documents connected to the Metropolitan line. They'll only be reproduction colour copies, sort of A4 size, but if you'd like those, I can send those to you.
Oh, we'd be delighted. Yeah, that's really kind of you. Yeah, we'd be absolutely delighted. Yes, please.
Okay, I'll get those, sort those out to you through the move. Is there an address on the website?
Yes, yeah, or if you
Okay.
stay on the call on the end, I can give you the details as well.
Okay, I'll do that, and I'll tell you where you can find some of the copies online.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yes.
Ian, have you got a website? Because I'm sure other people might be interested in that.
Yeah, the website is railarchive, all one word, .org.uk.
Sorry, what? I didn't catch the name.
Rail Archive.
Rail Archives. Okay.
.org.uk.
I'll type it in to the chat. Great. Well, we're going to, unless there's any more questions, we're going to finish with a very light-hearted quiz. So we're just going to do it as a poll, as we've done before. I think this might start a whole thread of things which we realise there are some gaps in our knowledge in the museum about the meanings behind house names and street names locally. And I thought of it because we'd done a quiz before on our Metroland embroidery, so I was trying to think of something else. And a few weeks ago, I was very fortunate to be given the chance to go to look at a house where the same family had lived for nearly 100 years in Chesham Boys. And fortunately, the last owner had died and they were clearing the house out. And one of the objects that we took was the front door, which was not, had been made sort of the second front door because there was a modern porch and door in front of it. It was absolutely beautiful. We presume from the 1920s, so very much sort of the ilk and era of Metroland. And it is a beautiful stained glass door, which we now have the stained glass part on display in the museum. And the name across it on the stained glass, I probably pronounce it wrong, was Inversnade or Inversnade, which I looked up, and it's a village on the edge of Loch Lomond. And so I haven't quite worked out the connection yet. I'm sure the family will be able to tell me, but it did get me thinking again about all these really interesting house names and streets that we have locally. So here's the poll. You can give more than one answer if you want to. That's all I'm going to say. So I'll launch it now. See how you get on, and then I'll tell you the answers. Okay, I'll wait for about 10 of you have voted, so I'll wait for everyone to, or as many as if you want to finish.
Emily, it wouldn't let us add more than one note, jump from one to the other.
Oh,
you can only
okay.
only log
Okay.
one.
Oh, sorry, my settings must have gone awry. Okay, well, I'll explain that in a minute then. About 3/4 of you have voted, so I won't stop it, but I'll put you out your misery. I'm sure you can't wait to hear the answers. So Killasby, or as some people call it, Killer Spy, is named after a village in Ireland where the first owner lived. That's a house on North Road in Cheshire Boys. High and over, I assume you probably all know where that is, but that is the wonderful modernist house which is set just up from the old town. That's a surprising one, which Alison found out recently. It is named after a hill in Alfriston, Sussex. And if you Google High and Over Alfriston, you do find it. And Sir Bernard Ashmole's wife wanted to name the house after that, which presumably she had a connection with the place. Plantation Road, I think you all got that one right, was where the plantation estate was, which the Weller family, the brewers, had owned, and they had connections with Jamaica and sugar plantations. And then this one, I think that's where my settings might have gone slightly wrong. So you're all correct, because all of them have a connection with their developers. So Kennard Close is a bit of a red herring because it's a modern road, but it is named after Kennard, who, as many of you know, was our notable arts and crafts architect who built many of the houses locally. Leigh Wood is Woodley, after Alfred Woodley, who was responsible for lots of building locally. Stanley Hill is Stanley, oh, I've forgotten, Alison. Stanley
Hamp.
Oh, it is Hamp, yeah, who again was responsible for lots of developments in Amersham. And Abraham's Close is up by Lincoln Park, which is named after Miss Abrahams, who owned the land where those streets have subsequently been developed. But I imagine you've all probably got some good stories about your house name or street name. So if a couple of you want to share them before we finish, we'd love to hear that. Or if you've got some that you'd like to tell us afterwards. There were a few more that we know, but there are some that we haven't quite worked out. So do share them if you'd like to.
There was one more question, I think, on the chat about freight.
Oh, I missed that. Oh, thank you. Do you want to do that one, Ralph?
I'll try. There isn't a simple answer.
Did you just tell everyone the question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. The question is what happened to the freight on the railways? There were a number of reasons for the decline in freight, but a fairly significant one was that after the First World War, there was a surplus of trucks, and also people left the army able to drive. And many of them were, because of the economic situation, took it on board to become van drivers and delivery drivers, etc. The railways at this time, their freight charges were controlled centrally, and it was very easy for them to be undercut. And so that started, if you like, the rot as early as the early part of the 20th century. And then there's a whole host of reasons of mismanagement, of perhaps union inflexibility, of inefficient working practices, of old stock, etc., which gradually led to the huge decline on the railways and subsequently the growth of road traffic.
Thank you. Well, has anyone got any other questions, anything they'd like to ask before we finish?
Val has, but she's on mute. Val, unmute yourself.
Yeah, now I'm doing. It's actually Ewan. I was just curious if Ralph could say anything about the different gauges. You mentioned the 2 gauges they were using in the railways. Why did the smaller one get the standard, become a standard?
Good question. Very good question. The smaller gauge, the 4 foot 8.5 or standard gauge, was established many years actually before railways really existed as we know it. They were used for tramways and trackways in coal mines up in the northeast, etc., for many, many years. Brunel sort of wanted to run his trains fast, and he wanted something more sort of comfortable, and he deemed that 7 foot would be better, and probably technically he was absolutely right. But the reality is that he was completely outnumbered, because the Great Western was the only one that adopted that gauge. Everyone else went with a standard gauge. And if you can imagine, it caused quite a bit of chaos. You know, if a train needed to go from Bristol, for example, to the northeast, it meant at some stage everything had to be moved from one train to another. So they gradually, the Great Western laid a third route in effect so that the tracks could accommodate both. But in the finish, they lost and everything went to the standard gauge.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. I've got a few resources to show you if you want to find out more. Oh, sorry, that's my phone. Yeah, there we are. So Ralph, on the museum's website, if you go under history and then just put in Metroland, you'll find a longer article that Ralph has written that's similar to the story that he's told you today. So if you want to read a little bit more, you can. If you Google London Transport Museum Metroland, there's a nice article there about it too, with some extracts from their collection. So you might enjoy having a look at that. And then if you're interested in watching this again, it will be available on our YouTube channel, hopefully within a week, but also previous episodes are on there too. So again, if you just Googled Amersham Museum YouTube, you should find the channel. And usually it comes up with this page, but you have to click on the bit here that says videos, and then you'll see some of the previous ones that we've done, and this one will be up there soon as well. So they're all there if you want to have a look at them.
There are also direct links from the website as well.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. So Ralph, thank you so much. I think you did a tremendous job today. It's really interesting, and I think it's probably a topic, there's so much that we could talk about. You know, if anyone has anything they want to share with us about Metroland housing, or you know, around some of that promotional literature or the development of railway, I'd be really interested to hear from you. Our next month, our local stories will be on the 16th of June, which will tie in with National Refugee Week. So we'll be looking at refugee stories locally, particularly around Belgian people in the First World War, and the Polish community and the Second World War. But again, if you've got a story or something you'd like to share with us for part of that, we'd be really keen to hear from you. And then in July, I'm hoping that we're going to do something about sport, just in advance of the Olympics, which are hopefully going ahead. So that would be quite a fun one. So thank you all for joining us. Really lovely, especially so many people came on.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right.